Well, hello and welcome to the Roundtable on Marginalized Voices in Literature. This happens as part of the Brave New Literature online festival organized by Versopolis, a European platform for poetry and culture. And with us today are three brilliant writers and one brilliant interpreter, but we'll get to that. Hilà is an Israeli-Palestinian musician and poet. She's a founder and member of several acclaimed ensembles and performs early music as well as classical Turkish, Arabic, and Andalusian music. Her first poetry collection, Soul, was published in 2011, and it was followed by Until the Morning and Wooden Roof. The discussion will be joined also by Nora Verde or Antonela Marušić. She's a Croatian poet, writer, editor, and publicist. As a student, she published her first poetry collection, Sezona Bjegova, and she is also the author of novels Posudi mi smile and Do isteka zaliha. She's also one of the founders of the feminist portal Vox Feminae, to which she contributes and for which she has been an editor since 2011. And as mentioned, she is joined by her interpreter for today, the poet, essayist, and translator Ivana Maksić. Hi to all. And then last but not least, we have Salim Haddad, an author, filmmaker, and aid worker of Iraqi German and Palestinian Lebanese descent. As an aid worker, he has worked with international organizations in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, and Egypt. His first novel, Guapa, was published in 2016. It's a political and personal coming of age of a young gay man living through the 2011 Arab revolutions. And then also his directorial debut, Marco, premiered in 2019. So now that we kind of got to know our speakers today, we can just jump into it. And I think we can start with the fact that if we are to talk about marginalized voices or the existence of a margin in general, we should acknowledge the existence of a center and the relation of those two, or the relationship between those two. I think we ought to start with the fact that it's a complicated relationship. It's an intrinsic relationship as well. How do you see those two? How do you see the codependence? Do you think that one cannot exist without the other? Do you think that a center needs its margin and vice versa?
Kao što si rekla, margina i kanon ne mogu jedno bez drugog i zapravo su u nekakvom vječnom pregovaranju i odnosu koji bismo jezikom društvenih mreža stvarno označili kao kompliciran odnos. I da, definitivno trebaju jedan drugog. Ivana, možeš prevesti.
Of course, the question of margin and the canon or the center itself is in the position to reflect one another, and they are in a perpetual negotiating position, which is, of course, pretty complex. And we can even say, using the language of social networks, a kind of complicated relationship, but they definitely need each other and they cannot survive without each other.
Kroz godine i stoljeća književna djela i autori neprestano napadaju taj kanon i pokušavaju se probiti u njega. On je definitivno željeno mjesto nekako i garancija da će neko djelo nekog autora ili autorice ostati važan za književnu povijest i biti upamćen. Svaka književna generacija u određenoj epohi ili škola na neki način se opire svojim prethodnicima i napada taj kanon. Evo, Ivana.
Canon itself is a kind of guarantee for the authors that they will be somehow there maybe forever, and that future generations will read their works. So it is a kind of desirable position for every author, or for most authors. However, there is also, as we already mentioned, a very complex relationship, because each generation, and especially those authors that are marginalized, are trying to attack the canon itself and the values that are somehow within the canon. So they're trying to attack it and they're trying to be included. So it's a very a kind of contradictory position.
To je manje više to, samo bih dodala mislim da svi na neki način i bivajući na margini maštamo i voljeli bismo nekako u određenom vremenu u budućnosti, možda i nakon naših života, biti dijelom kanona. Možda sad iz mene govori neka narcisoidnost ili taština, ali sumnjam da je mnogo onih koji bi rekli ne kanonu.
Even though many authors attack the canon and its values, most of them would like to be the part of it one day, and this is a maybe even subconscious wish of every author. Antonela believes that she has never met the author who would not like to be the part of the canon one day.
Hilà,
that's it.
Any additions before we move into the next question, which kind of relates to this as well?
Maybe I can jump in for a little bit. I think it's a bit confusing because when we're talking about the canon, we're talking about this idea of some sort of universal classical work of art or of literature that encapsulates this central idea of the human condition. And I can see the value of that in theory, but I think there's a big difference between what the canon represents in theory and what the canon represents in practice, and who gets to decide what is the center and what is the margin. Those are not fixed ideas. Those are active centering pieces of work and centering certain writers and works of literature is an active process. And who is doing the centering and who is sort of, on the outlines trying to get in is, I think, an important conversation. And so that's why I often feel like the question of canonization and the question of center and the margins is something that I think is very difficult to talk about in the abstract without bringing in questions of politics and power in our current time, and who's controlling these narratives and these centers.
Yeah, and this is exactly the question of gatekeepers, as you've said, like who is the one who decides who gets in, who doesn't. And then also, of course, the question of to what extent perception and representation of minorities is subject to historical transformation, as you've said, how that correlates with its historical context. And then I guess, Nora, as you said, this is a constant process. And if we talk about, ideas and authors moving from one to the other, we also always, I think, talk about the existence of a new margin. If things get seeped into the center, obviously there's a new margin that forms, and it's always a different one, Saleem, as you've said. It's always subject to its context in a way. And another question then comes to mind here, and it's a question that Harold Bloom posed. It's his idea of this school of resentment. Is there a school of resentment towards the literary canon, or the Western literary canon, we should say? He argued that sometimes, and I think this is very current and very important question, that sometimes political and social activism takes the front seat before sort of literary or aesthetic merit of what is taken into the center of, or what is praised as something of quality or something of importance. How do you see that? And maybe Hilà, we can start with you now. How do you see those two correlating? Do you think that sometimes it is just a question of kind of filling those quotas, if we can say in that way? That happens in politics as well a lot. How do you see that happening in literature?
Well, I have to say that for many years, I think as very young person, I used to think, yes, there would be like some sort of definite aesthetic or aesthetic values, but now I think, getting old and bitter, I think it's a very cute assumption that those two would, like, that there would be like a thriving aesthetic that lacks the politics, because I don't think we or anyone who's a little bit more than aware have the privilege to avoid the politics, because when we pretend to do so, or when we say, like, when we talk about merit or aesthetic merit, we are talking about privilege and our privilege, as Salim said before, about the canon and who gets to be in there and what gets to be important, whose aesthetics are merited, so to speak. I don't think there's a struggle there. And maybe if there is, it's to the contrary, that anything that would lack that urgency would lack that merit. That's at least my position in that regard.
And you don't see an issue sort of with, because it's interesting, right? This is also sort of a double-edged sword, I think, in terms of, because there is obviously more now focus on marginalized voices, and we'll get into that. And there is sort of this double-edged sword of, you know, obviously there was not enough of that, and obviously there needs to be an integration of marginalized voices into the center always. Then what tends to happen sometimes is that, as we've said, you know, the political and I'm not saying that, you know, there's just literary merit or just aesthetic merit. Obviously, any work is a political piece of work as well. But that sometimes that takes the front seat, you know, as let's say, because I've mentioned politics, let's say that you have, you know, a candidate and she's a woman and it's great, but her policies are terrible and her track record of what she's done is terrible, but she's being integrated into something because she's filling that quota that needs to be filled, because that's now, you know, that needs to be filled because then people are more, or brands are more marketable, or publishing houses are more marketable, etc. Do you see that as being an issue, or do you think that's just, like, again, a privileged position to have?
I think it's beautiful, because I think the perception of having a center is such a white European perception.
Right.
Like, there is one center, the center is here. It's here in Berlin, it's here in London. No, there are centers. And if this is marketable, this is beautiful, because that means that, hey, there's another center with different values. And I don't feel this anxiety of having, like, the aesthetic stolen from me or from, I don't know, I don't have this us, or
Can I come in?
Yeah.
You know, it's funny, because I do feel, as someone whose novel was published, I guess 5.5, nearly 6 years ago, it has been an incredibly frustrating experience, that the literary and aesthetic value of my novel has not been as appreciated as its usefulness in terms of being a representative of something, or as being sort of ethnographic.
Right.
Sort of its ethnographic or representative value trumps its aesthetic or literary value. And I don't think that actually this is purely done by, quote unquote, those in power, because I feel people within my own community have done that as well. And I've had questions being like, well, I don't know exactly if your novel represents the, you know, the experience of all queer Arabs. And so in that sense, maybe you're committing an act of violence by writing this book. And I've actually been asked that question by a PhD student in Canada, in a very sort of accusatory way, because my novel did well. I'm committing an act of violence by erasing all other queer experiences. And, you know, and I just feel this idea of representation is also a very dangerous one. It's a burden that's placed on, quote unquote, marginalized writers. And I think the solution to that is really in making sure that the door is open enough so that other people can write about these experiences, because if I'm the only one that's allowed in that door, then the burden that's going to be placed on what I produce is going to be insurmountable, and it's going to my work is going to collapse. But if I can use the small opening I have to open further so that other writers from my background and my position are producing stories, then I'm able to be more free in terms of the art that I can produce. So I do agree with you that there is a problem in terms of how we judge a certain work of art, but I think the solution is probably to make sure that we have more of it, because then you can judge a work on its aesthetic or literary value rather than just on its political or representational or ethnographic value.
Nora, what's your position on this?
My position. Upravo sam slušala Salema i htjela bih se nekako nadovezati na ovo jer mi se čini interesantno. I meni je bilo prilično strah u trenutku kad sam pisala roman Do isteka zaliha, u kojemu zapravo pišem između ostalog o temi partnerskog nasilja koje se događa u jednoj lezbijskoj vezi, u lezbijskom partnerstvu. Ivana?
I would like to mention my experience related to my first novel, which is called Do isteka zaliha. And it was very tough for me to write about a topic which deals with violence in a lesbian relationship.
Ja sam imala dojam, i to se na kraju i dogodilo, da ću biti napadnuta od strane dijela LGBT zajednice, da ću biti kritizirana zbog načina na koji pokazujem, reprezentiram život LGBT zajednice, budući da je i taj roman na neki način bio možda ne prvi, ali jedan od prvih romana koji govori o životima lezbijki u Hrvatskoj.
I had an impression that I will be criticized and maybe even condemned by LGBT community in Croatia, precisely because I was writing about this topic, since it was one of the first novels to tackle this topic. And this is what happened after the novel was published.
Da, dio LGBT zajednice mi je prigovorio na tome kao zašto sam na taj način prikazala život lezbijki na tako kroz negativno, naravno, makar to nije bio jedini fokus u romanu, bilo je u romanu i humora i svega ostalog, ali pokazala sam život lezbijki kao život nasilja kroz nekakve pesimistične naočale. Da, ja sam imala priličnu odgovornost pišući tu knjigu i zbog toga jesam imala veliku pauzu i anksioznost od pisanja sljedeće knjige.
So one part of LGBT community attacked me because I presented the lives of two lesbians in a relationship as a pretty violent one. And even though I focused on other aspects of this relationship and there were a lot of humorous effects in the novel itself, they didn't like the pessimistic view. And I was pretty aware of my responsibility that I had to deal with because I did so in my novel.
Mislim, zanimljive su recimo dinamike koje se događaju u tom jednoj maloj sceni koju možemo nazvati marginom, koja je recimo hrvatska ili regionalna LGBT zajednica, na kojoj postoje određena pravila i postoje oni na neki način koji te pravila propisuju, koji su nekakvi, koji su aktivisti, ranije afirmirani umjetnici u nekom polju kojima se vjeruje. I na neki način i tu postoji određena dinamika centra i margine. Čak i unutar tako malog odsječka, unutar tako malog komadića polja. Ivana, mrziš li?
No. There is, of course, a certain dynamics even within this marginalized, let's say, or marginal scene or queer scene, LGBT scene in Croatia and in the Balkan region, the whole Balkan region. And I feel that there are certain rules that are already established by prominent activists who actually brought something to this field, who fought for it, and therefore they feel entitled to impose those rules. So even in this small field, there is a question of position of power.
I think that's very interesting, actually, to see that inside, I mean, what both of you mentioned, to see that inside that field, there's this sort of, well, you mentioned responsibility, but it can also, I guess, be a burden of representation, you know, that then your work becomes this sacred cow because there's only one place for it. And I guess, you know, that tells to the fact that there's still, Saleem, like you said, there's still, the door isn't open enough yet. You know, the space for it is this big, and it's maybe for one author or two authors. And then I understand that, you know, you feel kind of this burden of having to represent a whole community. And the issue here, Nora, as you've mentioned, is that that community is very varied. You know, it's comprised of just so many different individuals, and you can never encompass
Many
it.
voices.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something to take away from it, you know, that, and Saleem, I like the fact what you've said, you know, that it has to be open for more people to come in and to be able to tell their story, you know. And what I wanted to ask, you know, because we have this burden on one side, which is obvious and it's very telling and it's very all-encompassing, but is there also a freedom of then, you know, let's say working on the margin? And if we mentioned before this literary and aesthetic merit of the canon, which is very privileged and very one-sided, is there a certain freedom that comes with working on the margin and having the ability to kind of bypass that in a way and not feel pressured to comply to those standards?
I understand what you're saying, but I think that this romanticizes the margins. You know, this idea that you have boundless freedom, etc. I don't have boundless freedom. You know, I'm a struggling writer from the margins, struggling to make my voice heard with the center that either wants to speak on behalf of me or does not want me to speak at all and will try to silence me in whatever way possible. There is no freedom in it. There is certain beauty and there's certain joy and there's certain sort of wondrous and revolutionary elements about these margins, about being on the margins and you know, seeing how they can crack open traditional ways of looking at the world, how they can challenge and subvert hegemonic ideas. But freedom, I don't think there's a freedom in writing from the margins. I think there's a lot of restraint and difficulties with writing from the margins. I don't choose to write from the margins. You know, I have been marginalized. There's no freedom in that position.
Hilà, you'd agree?
Yes, word, spot on. Thank you.
Now, since we, you know, now established that there should be more voices from the margin heard, and that might open up space for more people, but then also for the authors that already write there, like you guys, that, you know, then that takes the pressure off of you to kind of represent this whole community. I think there's an interesting question arising also that is connected to who gets to write those stories. And that's an interesting, complex idea, you know, so much so that PEN International a while back wrote this imagination manifesto manifesto that was basically about how artists should have artistic freedom to write about whatever they want, even if, you know, that white people should be allowed to write about Black people and non-queer people should be able to write about queer experiences and all that. And it's a really complex question, and I would love for us to unpack it, because obviously, while that is true, while there's artistic freedom to be had, there's also the fact that marginalized voices get pushed down and silenced, you know, and that opens the question, oh, if everybody is allowed to write about these experiences, does that mean, or will that mean that privileged people will get on top faster? So I'm interested in what you think about that, because it's a really kind of complex situation. Nora, what do you think about it?
Another hard.
I'm sorry, we'll get into easier ones later.
Okay. This is a festival of complex questions. Okay. Ja sam imala jednu kolegicu, imam još uvijek prijateljicu sa književne scene Hrvatske, s kojom sam vrlo često prijateljski polemizirala i debatirala na privatnim razgovorima o činjenici da ja pišem nešto što je labeled kao nekakva lezbijska queer književnost. I ona je vrlo često, zapravo ona je s vremenom razvila nekakvu tezu da sam ja profesionalna lezbijka, tako me nazvala. Da ja zapravo iz svog lezbijstva izvlačim sadržaj u potpunosti, budući da se bavim autofikcijom, sadržaj za svoju književnost, i da ja nisam lezbijka, da ja uopće ne bih bila spisateljica. Ivana?
I would like to mention a situation which deals with actually the friendship. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, who is also a Croatian author, is the one that we often battle or we have some kind of polemics. And these polemics are centered around this label that my literature is actually going through, which is often labeled as lesbian or queer literature. So her view on that is that I am a professional lesbian. She calls me a professional lesbian because of the fact that I write and I extract the basis of my writing, or the main topics of my writing, from the fact that I'm lesbian. So she even said that had I not been a lesbian, I would not have been a writer or author.
Pritom je ona straight, heteroseksualna i majka, a u svojim prozama između ostalog se bavi majčinstvom i brakom, partnerskim odnosima između muškarca i žene, heteroseksualnim odnosima kao nekakvim centralnim temama. Ja sam je naravno podsjetila na to da se ona dominantno bavi tim temama u književnosti, da su te teme zapravo u osnovi zanimljive velikom broju ljudi, velikom broju čitatelja, jer se povezuju sa vlastitim iskustvom, jer je u pitanju iskustvo većine. Ivana?
She is the author who is straight, so heterosexual, and she is also a mother. And she often writes about marriage, about motherhood, or heterosexual relationships. So I just kindly reminded her that within her work, she is also interested in these topics that mean something personal for her, and that the majority of readers could relate to.
Nakon što sam je to rekla, naljutila se i zapravo naš odnos ušao u prilično konfliktnu fazu. Međutim, ono što je meni iz ove anegdote važno je zapravo u čemu se, što nisam uspjela saznati niti nekako ekstraktirati iz ove priče s njom. U čemu se sastoji? Odakle dolazi ta potisnuta njezina ljutnja iz koje je proizašla ta njezina teza? Ivana.
After that, we experienced kind of a hard conflict, and it made me think what is the suppressed anger, what is the cause of her suppressed anger, and why is she thinking the way she is.
Je li bila u pitanju nekakva vrsta zavisti i zbog činjenice da je ta nekakva lezbijska kvir književnost u tom trenutku u hrvatskom polju bila smatrana uzbudljivom, ali samo na kratak trenutak. Da li već možemo recimo govoriti o onome o čemu si pisala u jednom od drugih pitanja, o nekakvom trendovskom postavljanju te margine i književnosti o marginaliziranim glasovima kao poželjne, kao moderne, kao nekakve brand new igračke u književnom polju. Možda se radilo o tome.
I was often wondering, was it her envy? Because at one point, lesbian or queer literature was considered and was even branded as something new, something exciting, or we can even say trendy and desirable, but it was only for a short time, like a kind of discovery of something new in literature.
Ali dalje sam i ja njoj na neki način zavidjela na stalnom radnom mjestu, akademskoj karijeri i činjenici da se na koncu veći broj čitatelja povezuje s njezinim iskustvom jer je njezino iskustvo dominantno.
I could also envy her, and I do envy her because she has a steady job, she has a brilliant academic career, and also on the fact that she has a very large readership because the majority of people can relate to topics she is writing about.
That's my sad story about it.
Saleem, any sad stories on your part about this? Well, sad stories, I mean, do you have this experience? Did you have any, discussions with your colleagues, authors, who are kind of, we'll get into the self-positioning onto the margin later, but do you have any of those experiences?
Experiences about what exactly? Sorry, could you repeat that?
This kind of double-edged sword of people who are not from marginalized backgrounds writing about marginalized backgrounds, or envying, in Nora's case, envying you for being able to do so. It's a really kind of tangled up position.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a bit torn about this because in theory, as an artist, I strongly believe that that I should be able to write about whatever it is that I want to write about, and that artists should be free to write about, and writers should be free to write about whatever they want to write about, and then be judged according to this by whoever is if someone who is not Black is writing from a position of a Black character, in theory, I feel like they should be able to do that, and then the audience will judge whether they feel that they've done a good job at this or not. But in practice, it's always more complicated than that. I'm also speaking as a queer Arab, a queer Palestinian who came of age after September 11 and the war on terror discourse. And so I'm very much aware of, I sort of became a writer within the context of Orientalism and within the context of the instrumentalization of certain narratives about the Middle East for broader political or military or imperial objectives. So I'm always very wary about who gets to say what. And I'm aware about the power of storytelling and who gets to tell stories. And also from a very practical, resource-based perspective, the inequality of resources often ascribed to marginalized people makes it very difficult to then say anyone can tell any story. Because it's true, anyone can tell any story, but if white writers are getting all of the power, all of the resources to speak on behalf of marginalized perspectives, then is that okay? And the way that I think about it in the most simplest way to me is that, you know, there's always a question, especially when it comes to the field of acting, can cis actors play trans characters? And in theory, of course they can. You know, that's their role as actors, is to inhabit the consciousness of anything. But in practice, how many trans actors get the opportunity to play the role of cis characters? Tiny, I mean, 0% nearly. So until we have that equality where trans actors are afforded the same opportunities that cis actors are afforded, then we cannot say that cis actors can play trans roles. And so I think that this is kind of where the complexity comes in between theory and the practice of power and resources.
Yeah, exactly. And would you say that this is also then a question of, I guess, you know, if we have authenticity of experience in terms of writing or, you know, any sort of art, you've mentioned acting, would you say that there's a difference between the two then? You know, that also if we're looking at something that, you know, we could get the most authentic experience from someone, that's what we should go for? Or would you say, you know,
I'm very wary about the idea of authenticity,
right?
Because I think that falls into the trap of representation and this universalization of certain experiences. Am I authentic enough to be able to capture the perspective of queer Arabs? But what is this idea of queer Arabs that I am somehow needing to prove myself to? I am who I am, you know, and I'm as much of an authentic queer Arab as someone who's completely different than me. That, you know, it's this idea of disrupting the centrality of something, right? For me, it's very much a question of power and resources. It's a very economic issue rather than the idea of authenticity.
Yeah. And Hilà, we can go into, I guess, Nora has mentioned, and we can call it, although it's a bit harsh, but we could call it sort of this abuse of the trend that is now centered, or that was for a while, like Nora mentioned, centered around the margin. Would you say that there's writers could kind of self-position themselves onto the margin for personal benefit, or is it such a small amount of people that it's not even, you know, while talking about? Would you say that there's people who, because Salim mentioned, you know, there's no freedom in it, there's no fun in it, there's like being placed onto the margin, and there's absolutely no benefits from it. Would you say that there's people who view it as a beneficial position for themselves, for their personal gain, for, you know, the gain of their work?
I mean, yeah, it's I think it's more of a political question than a literary question, and of course there are. And I mean, the quickest example that I could find is by means of appropriation, of course, and it happens also within the margins. It happens when I don't know, when I look around here and I see lots of queer festivals and they are all curated and being curated by cisgender men, gay men. That happens also, and that happens in vaster numbers and forms by cisgender straight people, by white people, by curating or choosing or publishing, you know, a yearly series or a yearly festival exotified people, exotified artists, because hey, here's our people of color edition for this year. So yeah, there's a huge exploitation around that basically serves to this gatekeeping or to these power positions or to this, yeah, and also by means of like, yeah, there's sort of this is our representation tax. Now we've paid it this year. There's no need for you people to show in any other editions or festivals. So yeah, I think it's being massively exploited.
I think it's interesting because, we often look at, politics, or even I think the most obvious example, like you said, is like brands or fashion brands, or, that people kind of, for their economic gain, bring in people from marginalized backgrounds. And this is what you said, Saleem, is like, it's an economic and it's a political question. And what's interesting is, at least in Slovenia, I don't know how it is around the globe, it's not often reflected back into the arts or into literature, because it's thought, oh, we're, open-minded people, it's all going in the right direction. And I think it's really, really important to kind of shed light and harshly shed light onto that in the literary field as well, because there's, just as much of that as it is in, like you've said, festivals or gatherings or brands or politics and all that. But since we've mentioned kind of leaving the door open a bit, and Hilà, we're on this topic now, and since we're mentioning the fact that it's kind of becoming more of a trend that it is, or more like a liberal turn than an actual process with consequences and long-lasting effects, what would you say then is the right process? How do you go about kind of bringing in marginalized voices and really integrating them, not just having them as like sacred cows, as we've said?
That's very big on my shoulders to come up with a solution.
Let's not save the world here, but give a few
I just name what I find most, what I miss most in the scenes I'm part of is the responsibility of artists themselves to make place for that. And that's an economic choice that could be to say, hey, you invited me to this beautiful paid concert. And I've noticed that actually, yeah, there are only cis person on this. How about I give my place and you curate like trans people in? Or how about we all gather and say, no, there's no place for like this sort of whatever homogeneous group that I was being part of. That's like something I'm missing, this sort of solidarity from many scenes I'm part of, or many colleagues I work with. So that's like the, I don't know, responsibility I would expect, or I would expect also from myself to be able to also give up that privilege, not only to yeah, I mean, because that's maybe related to like the former topic or the former question of like representation, when there's only space given by the canon to that many voices or characters or marginalized people. Maybe this place should be made not only by like looking up to the authorities and hoping for it to rain on us. Maybe that's something I would hope for. That's like one step.
Yeah, personal responsibility. I think that says it all, actually. But Saleem, do you have any personal experience, and then Nora, maybe we'll go to you as well, in terms of really feeling like your work has been, because you've mentioned, before that it's more kind of the other side of it, that your work is seen as this kind of beacon of a whole community. have you ever felt, and what was the situation where you really felt like the work was accepted as it is and it was really integrated, and it wasn't, you know, this kind of, oh, look, we have a queer novel or something like that, you know, that it's that it was really just accepted as it is, as part of a festival or a canon or whatever?
I feel like, no, I have not had that experience for the most part, but I have had that experience in terms of certain people reading my work and writing about my work and feeling like, oh, they understand what I'm trying to do beyond just the fact that it's a queer Arab narrative, that they're picking up on like the deliberate sort of literary styles and techniques and allusions that I've kind of been pushing through the novel. But oftentimes when, you know, I mean, I've stopped doing events, to be honest, the last few years, partly because of this, because there's only so much I can talk about queer Arab stuff over and over again, where I'm like, I have nothing more to say. I've said everything I have to say, which is why actually this conversation is refreshing, because I feel like I'm thinking about it from a slightly different angle, and it's really making me think about this idea of center and margin as something that is continuously changing and evolving. Because even though as a writer, I feel like, and you know, this is taken from Toni Morrison, who talks about, you know, not writing for the center, but pulling the center towards you. And I think I've kind of I try as much as I can in my writing to do that, sort of affirming my own position and saying, no, you need to come to me. And therefore I am sort of centering myself. In that process, as more and more people do that, you're decentering the margin, and then you become the center. And in the process of becoming a center, you create new margins who will then challenge your dominance. This is, of course, the ideal element. But I want to just sort of raise one thing, which is the idea of gatekeepers, especially when you're writing from the margin. And I can only speak about publishing because I'm a writer. But there's, you know, as a writer from the margins, you have to make it through a number of different gatekeepers. You know, in the context of English language publishing, this is, of course, literary agents who are primarily white, upper middle class, based in New York or London. And then you have to make it through publishing houses, which is a whole other ball game, which is a much more elite circle of, again, mostly white, mostly women, cis women, again, in the sort of metropolitan Western capitals. And then you need to make it through media. So my novel as a queer Arab writer needs to make it through these specific gatekeepers in order to then reach the intended audience that I want to reach, which is queer Arabs. So I, you know, as a writer, then I need to be doing this thing, which this African-American writer called Jennifer Riddle Harding called a masked narrative, where you as a writer are speaking to 2 or 3 different audiences at the same time. The white audience that you need to speak to in order to have a career, because this is always the implied readers, sort of a white, middle-aged, cis woman. But also you want to speak to your own people. And so how can I speak to this audience that will give me the platform, but also speak to the audience that I want to speak to? And I think, therefore, a key element of decentering the margins, moving beyond this idea of liberal identity politics, is to sort of take control over the means of cultural production. And increasingly, I feel like this is really where the power lies. It's great that we have more voices from marginalized perspectives, from my own perspective, let's say queer Arabs. But I think how much can we make sure that we are increasingly controlling the gates as well, making sure that we are also present in the field of literary agents, in the publishing houses, that we control the publishing houses. There's a new publishing house that just came out in the UK called Hajar Press, which is specifically by people of color, for people of color. And I think it's a really exciting initiative, because you are now saying, okay, we are now going to control the gates. And I think that that's the future in terms of moving beyond this, what you call the sort of neoliberal or the liberal idea of representation.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And to that, I want to kind of go to Nora, because you're also here in a way from the position of an editor, obviously. And what you've said, Saleem, is like how to get more people to those gates and to become those gatekeepers. And it's also, again, we're never going to get out of this complex situation. It's also a complex situation because as soon as you get onto the position of power, like you've said, you know, how do you make sure that you don't fall into that same trap? How do you make sure that you are responsible and that somebody holds you responsible? You know, Nora, how do you see, because you have a personal experience with that, not making it easy for you, sorry, but you know, how do you see your position in that? Because obviously I imagine, you know, like Hilà mentioned, there's a personal responsibility to give voice to marginalized voices. But then also, how do you make sure that you don't fall in those same traps that were laid out for you beforehand?
Ok. Sad ja kao urednica, ja sam urednica, kad pričamo o meni, kad pričamo o sebi kao urednici, onda je to možda nominalno stoji u mojoj biografiji da ja sam se bavila uredničkim radom, ali moje bavljanje uredničkim radom je skoro pa neka vrsta teškog, baš je ono, underground. Ja sam radila kao urednica za mali, ali utjecajan feministički portal i to ne na plaću, nego na nekakav strašno mali autorski honorar. Ivana.
As an editor, I must say that I had some experience. So officially, I used to be an editor, but in reality, this was a kind of underground, small but very influential feminist portal, which is called Vox Femine, and I didn't do it for a proper salary. I was a kind of volunteer or half volunteer there, so it was my part-time job.
Jako interesantna je ta pozicija kad mi sa margine dobijamo priliku da postanemo part-time gatekeeper i čak i Ivana, koja je sada moja interpretorica, je imala to iskustvo i vlastito i pisala je o tome za portal Distance nedavno. Tako da ja sam u tom svom polju, kad je bilo tih mojih, nazovimo to 10 minuta, zaista se trudila da otvori Vox Femine portal različitim glasovima, čak i nekima koji su mene osobno iritirali na margini.
This was a very good opportunity for me, even though I was I can consider myself partly gatekeeper, but I was trying to open up the space for those voices that I personally didn't like so much, or that sometimes irritated me within the scene, within the marginalized scene.
Međutim, kada govorimo o urednicima i gatekeeperima na književnoj sceni, hrvatskoj književnoj sceni, to je apsolutno nemoguće ih je usporediti s ovim što sam ja imala. U principu je to, u pitanju su ekonomski prilično moćne figure. U pitanju je novac kojem ja nemam pristup. U pitanju su vrste angažmana kojima ja nemam pristup. A ono što ja jesam, evo možeš sad, Ivana, sorry.
However, when we talk about real editors, powerful editors in literary publishing houses who are considered to be real gatekeepers in the mainstream literary scene, they cannot be compared to my position because they are, first of all, economically more powerful, and they have much more space to intervene in the field. So they are more powerful figures in any case.
Ali ono od čega ja recimo osobno ne odustajem i neka moja mala grupacija nekakvih kolega koji rezoniraju politički, ideološki sa mnom, je ne odustajemo od provociranja tih gatekeepera na način da neprestano, budući da smo cijelo vrijeme glasni i cijelo vrijeme zapravo ne uključujemo se samo u pitanja margine, ne uključujemo se samo u pitanja nekakve vlastite niše. Uključujemo se u sva pitanja koja su trenutno važna za književno polje i radnička prava na književnom polju. I zato smo postali glasni. I u tom trenutku ti možeš nastupiti s te neke pozicije nekog malo glasnijeg, angažiranijeg pisca, van književno angažiranog u književnom polju, i tu se tebe može čuti i ti na taj način nekako možeš napasti otvoriti ta vrata ili u krajnjoj liniji ne raznijeti ih, ali možeš napraviti neku određenu diverziju i kroz neko kratko vrijeme povući još nešto kolega sa sobom, ali to je težak posao.
What I'm personally trying to do with some other colleagues of mine is to constantly provoke and to question those gatekeepers that are in the position of power. And I think we need to be very loud, and we need to be engaged and to interfere, to intervene in all the issues, not only the issues that matter to us. Talking about marginalized voices, but we need to talk about maybe people whose salaries are low, about the position of workers, and that way, by being loud, maybe we can crack the door open, or we can make some small subversion in that
Jer ja
field.
kada govorim o potplaćenim autorima i autoricama u književnom polju, zapravo imam apsolutnu odgovornost da ne zaboravim prevoditelje koji su još, i lektore koji su još potplaćeni.
Talking about underpaid authors, I mustn't forget the work of translators or the work of people who are doing proofreading, because their position is even worse.
I kada u praksi dogovaram vlastiti posao, kada surađujem sa izdavačem vlastitim ili izdavačem koji izdaje knjigu, ja moram biti svjesna činjenice da su ti ljudi potplaćeni i moram se na bilo koji, ne mogu zatvarati oči nad činjenicom da će oni za moju knjigu dobiti toliko i toliko. I moram pokušati bar izboriti pošteniji honorar za njih. Tu je recimo direktno moja odgovornost. Tu nema mislim, to je jedini način koji cijenimo.
My direct responsibility is that when I am in the position of negotiating with publishing houses, I want to make sure that all the people are paid well, those people that will participate in the work, so meaning translators, proofreaders, and so on. I want them to be treated well, and I try to make sure that will happen. So I think this is my direct responsibility.
I sorry što ću sada, evo još samo just minute, razdire me jedna stvar već godinama. Ima na hrvatskom književnoj sceni i na regionalnoj imamo nekoliko jako zanimljivih, talentiranih pisaca i spisateljica koji su se u svojim djelima bavili marginom. I oni su prilično popularni. Međutim, kada dođu u fokus i od samog početka njihovog bavljenja književnosti, oni su angažirani unutar polja, na polju teksta. Međutim, na polju izvan teksta, a književni tekst je samo dio književnog polja. I ja smatram možda čak mnogo manji dio književnog polja. oni unutar ostatka književnog polja uopće ne prosvjeduju, uopće se ne pridružuju, vrlo rijetko se solidariziraju. Rijetko. Ne budu uopće među prvima koji se solidariziraju. Za pitanja koja su važna, ne samo marginaliziranim autorima, nego koja su važna cijeloj struci. Meni ta vrsta podijeljenog, ta dihotomija, mene to muči. Mene to iskreno muči i to je nešto o čemu ću, mislim, pisati u budućnosti, razgovarati s tim piscima, pokušati razgovarati. Meni nije jasno. Čak ne da bi ja njih provocirala, da bi ih osudila, nego nije mi jasno, ili je potpuno očito, zašto to rade.
Another situation that is slightly troubling for me is that there are many interesting authors who are writing now. They are very talented and they are in, we can say, in the limelight currently of the literary scene. And in their work, they deal with the position of the margin, but only in the text. So I do not consider literary field to be only something that is in this form of being written literature. I think this is much larger field, and the rest of that field is not interesting for them. They do not bother to participate in very important questions. And this dichotomy is very troubling for me. So in the future, I plan to write about it, and I plan to question, if possible, these authors through interviews or some other forms. Why is that the case?
Nora, what I think is really, really important and really fascinating what you mentioned is this importance of the margin, or let's say marginalized voices in literature having solidarity with any margin. And that comes to this question of power in general that Saleem was mentioning already. And Hilà, let's go to you for a bit, because you were mentioning, personal responsibility. But then I guess we could also talk about personal complicity in a way. And not just with specific gatekeepers, but with a position of power in general, and with power in general, I guess. Because there's a lot of this, we were talking about, sort of being responsible when you reach the gate, right? Having somebody to hold you responsible. But there's a lot of complicity, I think, on the part of just the readers or the general public of, oh, well, that's what people in positions of power do. That's how, just how power looks like, So would you say that once you're starting to talk about marginalized voices and literature in general, you can't go away from questioning power in general and how we relate to it? Would you say that there's this sort of personal complicity involved?
Well, there should be, in my opinion, yes. And because it is a question of power and it is a question of resources. So for me, I would find it hard to imagine that there.
And Saleem, do you think? Oh yeah, go ahead. Go on. No, I just wanted to ask Saleem, because you were, mentioning power as well. Do you think that that's something that each writer or anybody who produces or is involved in this literary system or any system should kind of carry with themselves?
At the level of storytelling, no. At the level of producing a work of art, no. It gets more complicated when the art is then entering into the public realm and also the realm of the market, because that's when questions of power become very important. But it's something that I know when I was writing, I was very much thinking about, because I was writing in English. And I knew that by virtue of writing in English, I was entering into a conversation that was already happening vis-a-vis issues of sexuality in the Arab world. And I was also entering into a conversation that was sort of feeding into broader imperial sort of ideas and Oriental sort of histories, Orientalist histories. And so I felt like I had a responsibility when I was writing and when I was telling a story at a later stage of editing, not in the immediate stages of writing, but when I was getting close to publishing, when I started to think, okay, what does it mean to write this book, and how can I maybe subvert or challenge some of these dominant narratives around my story that are already circulating, and how will my story be in conversation with these broader, much more powerful narratives? And I felt like it was important for me to do that, especially with my first novel. And then I think it became less and less important for me, actually. And I cannot tell you why, but I think I felt a responsibility to my own artistic vision, not to pander and cater to these dominant imperial narratives.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask next, is if you ever felt like you were subjugating yourself to self-censorship even, or just having to, because you mentioned, that there's this idea in your head, not maybe while you're writing, but before you start writing, that there's a primal audience that is the white female, and then, you have different audiences under that or alongside that. But do you ever feel like you need to tone things down or adapt things or self-censor yourself? Or even if it's not a conscious decision, maybe you go to reread something and you're like, oh, I didn't intend to make this like that. Do you ever feel like that?
Yeah, all the time. And I feel like it's not an easy answer. I mean, to give you a very practical example, in the novel that I just completed, and I sent it to my agent, and it's a very long novel, but in the first or the second chapter, there's a very explicit sex scene between the main character, who's a sex worker, and the client. And me and my agent had a very long discussion about why we decided to pull that scene. But we had a very long discussion about why we were pulling that scene, and whether we were pulling that scene because it didn't add any value to the narrative, or we were pulling that scene for a strategic reason because it would alienate a readership. Because the rest of the novel is not really about anything to do with that. That scene is a very explicit sex scene, and then the rest of the novel is about something completely different. And I think we both agreed that we were removing it because we didn't want to alienate a certain readership. We felt it was important to the story, but we felt strategically it was a better idea to edit the scene out. It wasn't important enough to the narrative to justify alienating the readers. And this is, I think, a decision that I think you have to make when you're engaging with the market, right? I can make art and I can say that I want my art to be sort of pure and speak to my own intentions and blah, blah, blah. But I can also be strategic because I also want to have dinner at night. And I can say, okay, I would like to eat, so I don't mind removing the sex scene. It's, on the scale of things, it's not that bad. I don't know, maybe this is a very specific example to your question, but.
No, it's a perfect example. Do you have any of those experiences, Hilà? Because I see you nodding and laughing, and you must have something. I mean, are you kind of looking at things in this practical way as well, or do you just feel like, oh, this is my content, I don't really care about how the market gets it, I'm going to put it out and then the market should adapt to it? You know what I mean? How practical are you about those things?
I think, okay, my position is very different because I don't write prose, so I cater to 1.5 people that are that might be a middle-aged white woman, but the work are mediated to them by middle-aged white men, which are the book critics or the poetry critics. So I think my position has shifted drastically after one of my publications into like, really, I don't give a fuck anymore. Or maybe it's not my position about this as the more like, that's not my center anymore. That's not my canon. So, and I also have to say that I've had the privilege, or I have my second non-profitable job. I'm a working musician, so I can afford to scrap my dinner elsewhere. So that's also a very different angle, but I think I shifted that position of censoring into like, okay, I censor it for like the same questions, like, is it really that important to be there that you might lose someone's ears or someone would stop listening to you for that? But that's my censorship for now. Yeah.
Now, if we're talking about positioning yourself onto the market or into the market, what happens oftentimes, and Saleem, you've mentioned this, is a certain classification that might do good, but might also not, of queer literature, women's literature, African-American literature, feminist literature, whatever it is, you kind of get placed into a certain box. And there's kind of a double discourse here as well, because you can say, well, that's great, because that means that more people are going to have that door open, and it's going to be discussed, and it's going to have a place in the market, or like a tag on a bookshelf or something. But in the other way, that also means like pigeonholing you into a certain, let's say we've mentioned aesthetic before, or discourse or content. Nora, how do you see that? How do you see yourself in relation to that when you kind of enter the market? Because we're there now. When you enter the market, do you want that to happen? Do you want that to be, oh, that's feminist literature, whatever? Or do you just want to say, I don't really care, I don't want to talk about it, it's just literature, How do you see? Oh.
Jako mi je zanimljivo bilo što su pričali Salem i Hilà. Ja nemam agenta i ne razmatram ovako strateški vlastitu karijeru poput Salema, ali može se kroz moje iskustvo sa posljednjim romanom recimo zaključiti da vjerojatno podsvjesno i sama cijelo vrijeme razmišljam i cijelo vrijeme mi je na ramenu mi se nalazi ta neka svijest, mislim, cijelo vrijeme svjesno i posvjesno komuniciram s tim javnim mijenjem, s tim tržištem, zato što smo u potpunosti obilježeni tim. Naša svakodnevica je na svim poljima obilježena tim pitanjem kako preživjeti. Tako da sumnjam da je naš proces pisanja lišen toga. Ivana, ubij me.
It was interesting for me to listen to the experience of both Hilà and Salem, but I don't have the same experience since I don't have a literary agent, and these kind of conversations or some very, very detailed strategy when it comes to publishing my work, but maybe I can mention the experience related to my last novel, which is called My Dowry. And I could feel all the time, both consciously and subconsciously, this inner communication, thinking about the audience, thinking about how the market works. And I think we are all marked by that in one way or another, because we need to think how to make a living after all. So it is impossible to avoid in nowadays world.
I ja cijelo vrijeme, ja sam sigurna da ja cijelo vrijeme sebe na neki način preispitujem i samoj sebi bježim od vlastitog cenzora. Znači ta igra između mene i jednog dijela mog spisateljskog identiteta i tog mog cenzora, unutarnjeg cenzora kojeg ja plaćam i kojeg ja stvaram, koji proizlazi iz mojih nekakvih želja i potreba. To je isto zanimljiva igra unutar mene i tu se isto osjećam, to me zapravo jako iscrpljuje u danima kada razmišljam o tome.
I am often questioning myself, and there is a kind of dialectics between this inner self-censor within myself, which is somebody that I create at the same time, and who has their own wishes or hopes. But this kind of conversation can be very exhausting.
I za kraj, recimo sad je jako interesantna ta situacija koja se meni događa sa novim romanom, koji je do sada najšire prihvaćen od publike i čitatelja. A činjenica je da je to moj roman, znači on je najšire prihvaćen, najčitanije, jako se piše o njemu, ali činjenica je da je to roman u kojem ima najviše lezbijskog sadržaja, kontenta. Iz činjenice, naravno, zbog toga što pričam o djevojčici koja još uvijek ne osjeća, niti ne osvještava do kraja lezbijsku žudnju. Ali je činjenica da baš, ja imam osjećaj da baš zbog toga se veći broj ljudi može povezati s tim iskustvom, jer se radi o djevojčici koja je odrasla u 80-ima u Jugoslaviji. Znači, to je neko common iskustvo koje dijeli veliki broj čitatelja.
It is very interesting that my last novel is widely accepted, or more accepted than it already has a larger readership. And in this novel, the main protagonist is a girl who is still not aware of her sexual orientation. So there is not much explicitly sexual or lesbian content in this novel. So maybe that is the reason why so many people can identify with it, because it is situated in the 80s in former Yugoslavia, and in a way this is a common experience, or some common experience that many people can relate to.
I think it's
that be it for now. Yeah, Saleem, I think you were writing something down, but even if not, I have a question for you, since it's so specific, because you're kind of positioned into kind of the Anglo-Saxon market right away, and it is quite different, to kind of have that come out to such a wide audience. Are you keen on those kinds of I guess labels of what your literature falls under? And then also, because we were talking about the market and publishers in general, and you were mentioning readers, are you then aware of, they'll suit the readers more, or they'll be able to identify this category? And because we were saying that can be a burden, but can it also help? Can it also allow a certain readership to kind of be able to enter this field that they might be a bit scared of, or
Yeah, I think you're touching on kind of the paradox of it. I think I actually did not want to write a story with a main gay character as my first novel. It was something that I inevitably did when I started writing, but I was actively hesitant about doing so because I was nervous about being ghettoized, which I think I have been, but in actual fact, I think that I've actually found super, this goes back to the idea of the center versus the margins. When I was starting out, I wanted to be in the center. And then I realized, actually, no, I need to be where I am and bring people to me. So it's kind of funny because I get a lot of like straight Arab men who come up to me and they're like, actually your book is good. Like I wasn't going to read it because I just thought it was a gay thing, but actually you talk about like revolution and love and I was like, yeah, I know. I mean, this is, I know that my book is good. I know that I talk about these much larger themes. It's not just a book about identity, it's about something much larger than that. But, they're shocked that I could produce something that would speak to them and their interest. And I often find it frustrating in that sense to be labeled as a gay writer because you lose those sort of those readers who maybe are not sort of very, let's say, who are quite restricted with their interests. But at the same time, I think it's been, I've really seen that my role has played a value in terms of being a lighthouse of sorts. Like I'm one lighthouse among many other lighthouses in the queer Arab community, because for whatever reason, whether it's my own positionality, my own privilege, my own family being slightly more liberal, I'm able to be out and speak about these issues publicly, and I'm able to therefore, people who might not be in the position to be out can see me and gravitate towards me and kind of see, feel heard and feel seen and read my work and feel like it speaks to them. And I think those people will have value in terms of the sort of, when you label something as gay literature, it's a way for people who are actively trying to seek out that can go. When I'm writing, I don't consider it. I don't consider all of these things about where do I position this novel or, what genre is this, that sort of thing. That stuff is not my role as a writer to do. It's the role of, booksellers and publicists to figure out, because that's what they do.
Well, I think in given the amount of questions that we've opened and even more like paradoxes that we've opened, I think that's a good way to kind of wrap things up, to say that also it can also, at the end of the day, be like a lighthouse for people, and that it can also bring more people in and more audiences that people might think, and that also readers themselves should approach things in that way with sort of an open mind. And I do hope for all of you, even for Ivana, for really all of you, because I know all of you write, that even more people that you wouldn't expect will come up to you and say, well, your book is good, I hope that will happen more and more and more. And as we've said, be it on the margin or in the center, anywhere that you want to position yourself, really. Well, good. I think, we can go from here now into our own rooms and our own thoughts. I think we have a lot to think about now. I think we've opened really more questions that we gave answers, which is in a way always a good thing. I want to thank all of you for your time and wonderful ideas and personal experiences, which are really invaluable. I want to thank all the viewers, all the listeners. And then lastly, Anna and the Versopolis team for bringing us together. I think these kinds of conversations are really, really precious, and I hope they'll happen more often. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pia, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.